Welcome to No2Nato, No to War. My name is Richard Medhurst, and I'm filling in today for George Galloway. When it comes to Syria, we have to do a post-mortem, and it's an ongoing process because every single day, every single week, we're seeing a lot of changes coming to this ancient land. And the day the ceasefire in Lebanon kicked in, Netanyahu, he went on television and he essentially threatened Bashar al-Assad and said that he better not play with fire. Now, this was his go-ahead. This was Netanyahu's go-ahead to Jolani, who heads HTS, which is backed by Turkey. And they quickly went in and took the country. And immediately after the invasion of Aleppo started, and I'm calling it an invasion, not a revolution, because normally a revolution is carried out by the people of the country. It's not carried out by armed mercenaries. And in any case, they went all the way to Damascus. One city after the other fell: Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and then Damascus. And so Israel's fingerprints are all over this. NATO's fingerprints are all over this. And we have to talk about that because we can't call this a revolution when you have foreign countries. And we're talking about dozens and dozens of different actors, all with their hands in the cookie jar or their fingers in the pie. So remember that Daraa is close to the border with Israel. I find it astonishing that when it comes to these so-called rebels, right, who claim that they're fighting for the freedom of the country, for the betterment of the country, they came, all the way to the Golan Heights, and then instead of confronting Israel, they do a 180 and go all the way to Damascus, right? So you can see from their behavior that there's something very wrong here, and we'll get to their rhetoric in just a moment. But this invasion was planned. It was coordinated by Turkey, by Israel, and of course, not to forget the United States, which is another NATO country, occupying almost a third of Syria, roughly a third of Syria, and the most important areas in Syria where you have all the wheat and crops that are grown. This is called the breadbasket region. And then, of course, the oil. The United States is sitting on all of Syria's oil. And while Syria is not a major oil exporter, it still represents a large portion of the government revenue, about a quarter, if we look at the figures from 2010, 2011. And so a few hours after this invasion, we saw Israel coming in directly and stealing even more land. It stole an area of Syria that is roughly twice the size of Gaza. Okay, it just took it in one fell swoop. And most notably, Jebel el-Sheikh, which is a very strategic mountain. It's actually called that because it means the mountain of the Sheikh, because the snow at the top of the mountain is like the hat on a Muslim leader. So that's what it's nicknamed. In English, we'll call it Mount Hermon. So that mountain is I can't overstate enough its strategic value. If you're at the top of this mountain, this is the highest point in all of Syria. You can look at Lebanon, you can look at Palestine, you can look at Syria. It gives you an enormous advantage, and it is a strategic vantage point. Israel has now taken that. That has fallen into their hands. And so it's not just the size of the land that they've taken, but also the quality of the land, so to speak, rather than the quantity. That is a major, major, major loss. And then the Israelis went in and started destroying all of Syria's arsenal. They went and took out the navy in Latakia, in Tartus. They went and destroyed the fleet of MiG fighter jets that Syria had. And they destroyed all of these conventional armaments. And you have to remember that these are not weapons that belong to Bashar al-Assad or the regime, right? Which they love throwing this word around. These weapons belong to the Syrian people. They represent Syria's ability to defend itself from people like Israel. So by destroying all of these conventional armaments, all of the ships, the jets, the tanks, Israel has made sure that Syria is effectively neutered, that it is impotent, that it does not possess any fighting capacity, offensive or defensive, for the next decades. And remember, this is a lot of R&D, research and development, over the course of decades, over 50 years that Syria had accumulated, all gone now. The Israelis carried out 500 airstrikes and destroyed everything. And while these so-called rebels were in Damascus, where some of these bombs are falling, they said nothing. They said nothing. They acted as if it wasn't happening. They pretended as if 500 airstrikes hadn't occurred, that, you know, there wasn't a foreign enemy inside the country stealing land, encroaching on Syrian territory, and you know, surrounding the capital. The Israelis are about 16 kilometers from Damascus now. So this Jolani is an Israeli agent. Okay, let us be very clear. And his name, Shara, we're not even sure if that's really his name, but we'll just call him Jolani for now. You know, they offered amnesty. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, is an Al-Qaeda rebrand. You have to understand that. This guy, Jolani, is a friend of Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's number 2. He, with his blessing, he went and you know, opened up a Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, and then he supposedly split, quote unquote, but his practices certainly didn't change. And so what we're dealing with is a rebrand. We went from Jabhat al-Nusra to you know, Al-Qaeda to Jabhat al-Nusra to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. You know, this is not, their spots are not going to change. We have to be very clear about that. Their stripes are not going to change. And we can see from their behavior in the last weeks, they've been, you know, torturing, beating, executing random people on the street, you know, even boys, young boys, teenagers, you know, acting as if they are generals in Bashar al-Assad's army, and you know, just using this excuse that this person is an Alawite, and so they're obviously, you know, an accolade of the regime, and they have to be beaten and tortured. So it's not meet the boss, you know, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It's meet the new boss. They're actually way worse than the old boss. That's really what's going on. Social media is flooded with these clips of horrific crimes being carried out. And we also saw them attack Ma'lula. Remember that Jolani himself was in command when Ma'lula, a Christian town, was attacked in Syria. This is one of the last places on earth where they actually speak Aramaic, which is the same language that Jesus spoke. Syria was known for being secular, and now it's being run by Islamic extremists. And again, I use that, I want to caution the word, you know, Islamist or Islamic here, because this is sort of a concoction. These people themselves, they are agents of the West. We know how Al-Qaeda came to fruition, and now we can see again another iteration of the West supporting Al-Qaeda, but now instead of Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's happening in Syria. And they changed the school curriculum even. If you look at the changes they made to the school curriculum on the 1st of January, they've destroyed very important historical figures in Syrian history. For example, Queen Zenobia, who literally, you know, cut through Roman forces. Okay, this is no random queen. She was very smart and strategic, and they are claiming that she's a mythical figure. They removed her from the curriculum. So this is basically an attack on women. It's an attack on Syrian identity, on history, and it's sort of like degrading the country for absolutely no reason. Evolutionary sciences have also been removed, and they've replaced them with Islamic terms. And the thing is that these people like Jolani, they claim to be representing Muslim interests and that they are, you know, Islamic, but scientists in Syria, Muslim scholars 1,000 years ago, would be horrified, mortified by this kind of ignorance and their behavior. You know, when we talk about the Islamic golden age, where you had all these Arab and Muslim scholars contributing to fields of science and mathematics and you know, inventing algebra and advancing medicine, this happened in Syria, this happened in Iraq. They would be mortified by these people, by these terrorists who are now collaborating with Syria's enemies. So I want to start off by bringing in Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you for joining us on No2Nato. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Can you hear me, Scott?
Oh, I can hear you. I said I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Great.
It's good to see you. And I want to ask you, now that we're about 7 weeks out from the collapse of Bashar al-Assad and you know, this era coming to an end, what do you see when you look at the state of Syria today?
I see the black flag of Islam, something that should never have flown over Damascus, modern day Damascus, raised. I see Syria, the Syrian nation, fracturing. It's non-existent as a nation. I see a vacuum of power that is being filled by poisonous ideology. I see the United States. I'm not saying that Israel, of course, isn't happy about this, but let's be clear. Al-QAEDA, Jake Sullivan has gone on record saying this in a memo sent to Hillary Clinton. Al-QAEDA in Syria is a agent of the United States. Okay, we empowered them. We did this directly, and we did it indirectly through Turkey. And the mission of this Al-QAEDA group was to get rid of al-Assad, to undermine his regime and to facilitate his removal from power. And so once again, the United States has started something based upon the premise of regime change. And when they are successful, they don't have a plan for what happens next. We saw this in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. We saw this in Libya with Gaddafi. And we're seeing it today in Syria with Bashar al-Assad. There is no plan. This is chaos, total chaos. They're making it up as they go along. And the international community is struggling to try and put lipstick on a pig. And I know that's probably an improper analogy given the Islamic reference, but this is what I see in Syria today. I see, Al-QAEDA, who I despise with every fiber of my being, being coddled because there is no alternative. I mean, if the world was to reject Jolani, who are they going to replace him with? There is no Team B. Turkey was supposed to be creating a Team B, these national security or the National Syrian Army, a bunch of overfed acolytes of Erdogan, but they were taken by surprise. You see, this collapse of Bashar al-Assad was not a planned event. The United States was not saying, okay, in November, December, Assad's out. This was an action of opportunity by the Jolani and HTS, I believe, to put pressure on Syrian forces in Al-QAEDA to capture the M4 highway, to break that, because they had picked up from Turkey on difficulties between the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians and the Syrians. So they saw a moment of weakness. But I think the record will show that HTS was as surprised as anybody else as the Syrian army failed to solidify its defense. And as the Syrian army withdrew and pulled back, HTS just kept probing and probing. It took everybody by surprise. The Turks were taken by surprise. They weren't ready for this. The National Syrian Army, they weren't ready for this. HTS is just moving. Nobody was ready for it. The Russians weren't prepared for this. The Iranians weren't prepared for this. Nobody was prepared for this. And next thing you know, up goes the black flag. It's over Damascus, and everybody's sitting there going, what the heck just happened here? And I still think the world is saying, what the heck just happened here? We don't understand it. And therefore we haven't quite calculated what the consequences of this will be. Even the Turks, who have had gained tremendous regional advantage here, they don't know what happened, and they don't know how to properly exploit the opportunities that have developed. And so I think everybody right now is just playing it safe. As for Israel, I think Jolani and the Islamists have always had sort of a back deal arrangement with Israel. We saw that in the Golan Heights earlier, where they would get medical treatment, etc. They were never going to fight Israel. They were never going to fight Israel, but they were never supposed to take command. Look, what the Israelis did, we can condemn it, as we should. But I have to tell you, Richard, if I were an Israeli general and Bashar al-Assad suddenly disappeared, I'd say take everything out. We can't risk not knowing who's going to control those. You may say those planes belong to the Syrian people, but what I'm worried about is HTS suddenly getting pilots going in there, or somebody else we don't know getting pilots and taking over. What about the Scud missiles that were in the underground tunnels outside of Damascus? Do those belong to the Syrian people too? Sure, but I don't care about that. I worry about the people who are going to get them, bring them up, and fire them against Tel Aviv. So from an Israeli perspective, it made total sense what they did to take all of this out, to neuter, as you said, Israel, but Syria. But I'll leave you with this, and I'm looking forward to hearing other people, yourself included, because this is my theory here. Syria was always an artificial state. It's a fake nation, and I say that because of the way it was born under a French mandate with arbitrary lines drawn across the map. And the Turks have always felt outraged about the Treaty of Lausanne in 21. Then later on, this map. the Turks have always said Aleppo is theirs. They've always said Idlib is theirs. Raqqa is theirs. And they believe this in their fiber. And I have to warn the Iraqis, Mosul is theirs and Kirkuk is theirs as well. And if you think this stops here, you are wrong. This is why what's going on with the Kurds in Raqqa is so important, because if the United States evacuates and the Turks roll in and seize control of that, they will not stop until northern Iraq belongs to Turkey. The Turks are in full Ottoman mode right now. But Syria was always this artificial state. The Baathists, just like they did in Iraq, because Iraq was an artificial state too, cobbled together by British mandate, etc. Saddam Hussein believed that he could bring together these disparate forces, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia, to create an Iraqi national identity. And I think Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad likewise believed that they could create Syrian national identity. They were never successful in doing this fully. What they built in Syria, many people said, was an Alawite empowerment vehicle. Now, and I know it's not that simple. It's more complicated than that. He had a better power base, but the perception of what we call the Syrian nation. I went down to Florida and spent a couple days with these Syrians in diaspora. And I was shocked by the things that they said, shocked, because I talked about defending the Syrian nation. And I said, you should be opposed to Turkish occupation and you should be concerned about the Turks seizing control. And they said, well, it was Turkish once before, and maybe what we need is a period of Turkish occupation to engender stability. And that's when I said, you're not a Syrian. You can't call yourself a Syrian. And this is the problem. The people who are in control now aren't Syrians because they don't believe in Syria. They never have identified with the Syrian nation. They've always had some sort of alternative interpretation of what Syria should be, what it should be composed of, etc. And I think this bodes ill for the Syrian nation, because I'm afraid that when this is all said and done, Syria is going to find itself chopped up into constituent parts, and you'll never get the post-World War I Syrian nation assembled again.
You're right on many accounts, Scott. And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, even in Arabic, when you say Syria, it's interchangeable with Damascus and Levantine, right? So it incorporates the whole region. I mean, we're talking about Lebanon, Palestine, and I mean, until World War I, until 100 years ago, it was one region, one nation. Perhaps not in the modern European definition of what a state is, but certainly as a nation of people. And the whole goal is divide and conquer. And you allude to that with the idea of Syria being chopped up into tinier pieces. Having an Alawite enclave and then having a Kurdish enclave, and then who knows how long Al-QAEDA will last in power. But it's definitely shocking. And I like to remind the viewers as well that if you look at the Christian population, this is relevant after all. It is the birthplace of Christianity. You look at Iraq. They've lost. Forgive me, I don't have the exact percentage off the top of my head, but I've published it before. It's roughly 90%. Roughly 90% of their Christians gone since 2003, and the same for Syria. So we're talking about 1.5 million Christians gone down to about 300,000. It's really shocking. It's really shocking, and not all of them were killed, but many fled, out of fear, and that is also another consequence of what we're seeing, where there's a lot of uncertainty in the air, and of course the people in charge are not tolerant or interested in coexistence. I'd like to ask you, Scott, when it comes to Donald Trump now, who's been reelected as president of the United States, he originally left the troops there. He did a maneuver, gave space for Turkey to enter, which again is a NATO army, and then he took the oil fields, and he said on camera, we're keeping the oil, we have the oil. What do you think he's going to do next? He's just going to keep extracting that oil as Biden also did, or do you think he's going to pull another maneuver? How do you see Trump acting in regards to Syria?
My concern is that Donald Trump will follow through with his campaign promise to get American forces out of Syria. Now, normally I would say I want American forces out of Syria. I especially believe that when Bashar al-Assad was the president and Syria was a viable nation state. I felt that the Americans had illegally invaded and occupied Syria, that we were in violation of international law and the laws of war by stealing the national wealth of Syria. And I felt that we were an inherently destabilizing force that was operating to the detriment of the stability of the Assad regime. I know I'm going to irritate everybody in your chat right now, but I'll tell you right now, Syria was so much better off under Bashar al-Assad than it is under HTS.
It was,
Syria,
and I saw it myself. Yeah. So
and Syria was a viable nation state under Assad. Unfortunately, I personally believe that the state of Syria is over. It's going to be chopped up and finished. So all the people out there saying Assad was Hitler, go to hell. You simply don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care. But we were destabilizing the Syria. The problem right now is Syria is totally chaotic and anarchic, and the United States now has a responsibility because we created this problem. Donald Trump may say this is a Biden problem, but as you rightly pointed out, Trump's the one who sent the troops into Syria. Trump's the one who seized the oil fields and made the maneuvers to get the Turks involved. If Trump pulls the American forces out of Syria precipitously, that creates a power vacuum for the Kurds that the Turks will then exploit. And what will happen is that the Turks will end any notion of Kurdish autonomy in Syria, and then they will further that by going into northern Iraq. And you will be seeing a larger conflict as the Turks seek to suppress, finally, the notion of Kurdish independence. Now, I'm not believing that there's a pathway to a viable Kurdish state, but I do support Kurdish autonomy in Syria that's linked to the sovereignty of the Syrian state. I think the United States has an obligation to defend the Kurds until which time there is an agreement between what is going to be the Syrian government and the Kurds as to how Kurdish autonomy functions within a larger Syrian state. And this holds the Turks at bay, because I believe the Turks need to be held at bay to stop problems. So I'm not a fan of withdrawing American troops from Syria right now, because I think that would just create chaos and anarchy, a power vacuum that the Turks would fill and would lead to more chaos, more disruption, more problems. And once again, it's a total betrayal of the Kurds. So I don't think Donald Trump's going to do that, though, because he said, I'm getting the troops out. And Donald Trump is more about, the shallow concept of fulfilling a campaign promise as opposed to the more nuanced concept of what's good for not just American national security, but regional security and stability as a whole. And we have a duty and responsibility because we helped create the conditions that led to the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime. We have a responsibility now to ensure that when we do pull out, we don't make the things even worse than they are.
How do you think this bodes for Iran and Russia? Is this a giant loss for them? A catastrophic loss? How would you describe it?
I'll let the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards describe it. He said this was a terrible defeat for Iran, a strategic defeat for Iran. Okay, who am I to disagree with him? Now, but he hasn't taken it to catastrophic defeat. He has indicated that Iran, who has been in Syria for decades, has developed long-lasting relations with the Syrian people, and that Iran can use these relations to rebuild connectivity with the region. So, the Iranians are, again, I think, rightfully concerned by the collapse of Assad. It is very problematic for them, but some people, and I have to say, I had a darker assessment. I didn't think Iran would have the ability to get back into Syria. But when I hear the IRGC commanders say, no, we have the ability to regain connectivity with elements in Syria, I'm not going to be dismissive of that. The Russians, it's a different situation altogether. They were there solely to preserve the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Russia didn't go into Syria for regional ambitions and power play against the West. They came there at the invitation of Qasem Soleimani, who had coordinated with Bashar al-Assad to stabilize the regime, and they did that. The Russians today, I think if they are to stay in Syria, and right now it doesn't look too good for that, they would have to redefine their mission statement, because they're no longer there to prop up the regime. Their mission statement would have to become one of engendering stability. So it would be a different force structure, different concept of operations, etc. And I don't know if Russia is going to say that's to the benefit of the national security of Russia. I do think Russia has an interest in holding in check unfettered Turkish ambition, and that to have a Russian military presence in Syria, not to confront Turkey militarily, but to facilitate Syrian society to coalesce to say that Syrian society doesn't need Turkey to come in and take control. See, if you have chaos and anarchy, the Turks can run wild. They can just cite national security, and they can even throw out some international law stuff about, the collective security, etc., and they can move in with a free hand. But if the Russians are able to work with HTS to create some semblance of normalcy, that could put the Turks in check. And from a strategic standpoint, I think that's what Russia is interested in. They don't need Turkey going full Ottoman, because remember, the Turks pivot north. You have Azerbaijan, Armenia, and your problems with Iran, and Russia doesn't want any of that happening. So I think they'd like to dampen Turkish Ottoman tendencies. But I also think that Russia is looking at, a conflict in Ukraine, unresolved issues in Libya, growing demand for Russian resources, military resources in Africa, and looking at Syria saying, we no longer have to have this sump in here, which just absorbs Russian military capacity. Maybe it's time to cut the umbilical cord and move the Russian troops elsewhere. And I think that decision is being worked on in Moscow right now. But this was a defeat for Russia. The mission of the Russian forces was to preserve Bashar al-Assad's regime. They have failed. And now Russia has to deal with the consequences. But it's not a strategic defeat for Russia. Remember, they were willing to let Assad go. They had to be drawn in by Qasem Soleimani, directly intervening. But Russia was looking at that situation, not saying, "Oh my God, we have to go." Putin was hesitant. This wasn't, something he wanted to do, but he did it at great risk to send the troops in there. That mission's over, and I think Russia. I can't speak for the Russians, but I would say that I wouldn't be surprised if Russia decided that Syria just wasn't worth the effort anymore, and that they will go focus on what is becoming a primary focus of effort, which is the Africa Corps and what Russia's doing in the Sahel and elsewhere, in Libya, bringing stability out there. And again, about checking Turkish ambition. The Turks in Libya signed that maritime boundary in the Eastern Mediterranean, which redefined, the economic structure of the region. Russia's not in favor of that. And so Russia, I think, is looking at going into Libya and continuing to put pressure on, I think it's the Tripoli government that Turkey backs. Russia backs the Benghazi government. I think I have that right. I might have that wrong. One or the other. And I think the Russians are going to continue supporting there. So I think Russia, is managing a Turkish problem right now, and that Bashar al-Assad is in the rearview mirror. So this isn't an issue that weighs on Russia the way it weighs on Iran.
Scott, let me ask you, because you say that the Russians went in with this aim, and perhaps now they decided it's not worth the effort. What do you think of people who put forward the theory that actually Russia and Iran maybe stabbed Syria in the back? What do you think of that? Is that like a viable scenario given everything that's going on in the world? I mean, strategically, does that make any sense for them to do that?
It doesn't make any sense for them to do that. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But on the surface, I don't buy into this theory. And I think, again, it's still early on. We're still trying to figure out what happened. Nobody's done a thorough, at least nobody's publicly released any thorough debrief of Bashar al-Assad and what happened. But it's my understanding that the Russians had been pressuring the Syrian government for years prior to the collapse on the necessity of reforms, military reforms and things. And the Iranians had done the same thing. It's my understanding that the Russians and the Iranians had different perceptions on, how much support should be provided to Syria. The Iranians wanted to make Syria more of a bastion against Israel, and the Russians were under pressure from Israel to keep the Iranians from building this camp. So the Russians and the Iranians were at loggerheads on this too. But at the end of the day, it was Turkey who was always the junior partner in the Astana peace process that brought, an end to the fighting in Syria, or at least a suspension of the fighting. In the end, though, when HTS moved in, that gave Turkey the upper hand. And I think what happened here is I think they had the if I'm correct, they had the emergency meetings in Qatar. In Qatar,
right.
And you had the Russians, the Iranians, the Syrians, and the Turks there. And the Russians keep telling the Syrians, "You got to talk to the Turks. You got to talk to the Turks." Not because they were selling them, not because they were betraying them, because the Turks were the ones that were in charge on the ground. The Turks were the ones that could influence the situation. Russia was Russians were dropping bombs, but you can't drop bombs in a vacuum. There has to be a Syrian army on the ground that's facilitating it. The Iranians weren't being allowed in. The Assad wasn't going to let the Iranians mobilized 30,000 Iraqi popular militia and brought them up to Al-Qaim, and they weren't allowed to cross the border. So I think what happened here is that Assad had, prior to this, believed that his salvation didn't rest with Moscow or Tehran, but with Riyadh and the Gulf Arab states, that he wanted to become part of the Arab League again, that he felt that was the future of Syria. And the Russians are going, "No, dude, that's not the future. That may be where money's coming in right now, but we need to create stability. The foundation needs to be solid before you start putting on the new roof." Yeah. And Assad didn't do that. And at the end of the day, I personally believe that the betrayal came from the Gulf Arabs, because the money they were pouring in wasn't money designed to bolster the Assad regime, but rather to buy off people so that when the time came, the Assad regime wouldn't be able to respond. I think, somebody has to trace the money, but I just think that there's a lot of money in a lot of people's pockets, and that money weighed down so much that they just sat there when they should have gotten up and gone to the front line. And I think that money was Arab money. And I think that's where the real betrayal of Assad came from, not from Russia, not from Iran. They were just saying, "You got to speak to the Turks." But on the last day, it was too late. And the Russians went, "It's too late. It's over." And Assad I think he got duped by the Arabs.
Yeah, that I'm not surprised. And if we remember as well that Qatar wanted to build this pipeline that goes through Syria all the way to Turkey. I mean, they literally brought this up 3 days after the fall again. So, people were dismissing that as some kind of conspiracy theory when this is a real construction project. And again, I think it was the energy minister of Turkey. I forget which cabinet member, but he brought it up about 3 days after the fall, saying that, yeah, we might build that a pipeline through Syria. I mean, it's kind of shameless. And also we shouldn't forget that, Saudis are big on construction. There's a lot of money to be made by rebuilding a country that you've destroyed. And that's been done several times around the world by, the West and their allies. Unfortunately, it makes a lot of money for a small amount of people. So thank you, Scott. Really amazing insight. And I want to bring in now Professor David Miller. Hi, David. Are you with us? How are you?
I'm with you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. It's great to see you all. And I want to just start by asking you, David, how can anyone, who is serious about supporting the Palestinian cause, think that that what has transpired in Syria is good for Palestine in any fashion? That Syria exiting, falling, out from the axis of resistance is good for Palestine. How do we reconcile this contradiction?
Well, I mean, I think what has been interesting about it is the degree to which large sections of the left, the pro-Palestine movement, the anti-imperialist movement, whatever you might want to call it, has bought into this for a variety of reasons. So I think there's two key areas where people have, two groups of people have effectively bought into this. So on the one hand, there are those who've not really understood that the liberation of Palestine is a material act, that the Zionist entity will have to be collapsed, and that the only force which is capable of doing that is a military force, and of course the only credible military force in the region at the time is the Axis of Resistance. And so I think a lot of people on the kind of liberal left, the Stop the War left, the Palestine Solidarity left, don't have that conception. They think that somehow the boycott is going to liberate Palestine, or just marching is going to stop the British sending weapons, and the Americans and the Germans sending weapons on the spy flights. It's going to stop just because we march or because we boycott. No, it's not. The only way to defeat Israel, and it has to be defeated, is by military means. And the only way to do that, of course, is to supply military people, military personnel, the Axis of Resistance, to take on Israel. And when that happens, the Palestinians know this, Hezbollah knows this, and indeed Iran knows this as well. When that happens, then they win. But many people on the left in the West don't have any conception that that's what has to happen, and therefore they see Assad as being somehow irrelevant to the whole question. But then there's another section of people, and especially in the Muslim community, who have displayed through this process a really rather unpleasant, what's called what it is, a Sunni sectarianism, such that they believe that Assad, because he was Alawite, because of his alleged crimes, was actually not actually part of the Axis of Resistance, was actually a betrayer of the Palestinians, something which is actually completely false, completely contrary to everything that we know about what happened. Indeed, of course, we know that 2 weeks before he exited to Moscow, he was offered by the UAE large sums of money to betray the Axis of Resistance, and he refused. He refused. I mean, he was being advised to do it, but he refused. So there's a sort of segment of opinion. I mean, in the UK, it's represented, I suppose, by people like Dale Hussein from Five Pillars, or Mohammed Jalal of the Thinking Muslim, or actually Cage, an organisation I've had a lot of time for. I've been in that position as well. They've been simply saying that Bashar is a vile dictator, and he didn't support the Palestinians anyhow, and that is just completely false, totally misunderstands what was actually going on with the Axis Resistance. It totally misunderstands, of course, also in terms of ethnic politics. The fact that everybody knows that the Palestinian resistance, every faction of the Palestinian resistance, overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, and every faction of them, every single faction of the Palestinian resistance supported Bashar al-Assad, supported the IRGC and the Quds Force, and supports, of course, the Axis of Resistance, because that's where they get their weapons. That's where they got their weapons from. If you look back at the statements, not just of Hania and Sinwar, but all the way back, al-Aruri, the Hamas leader in Beirut. You look at the statements they made, and they say, well, we would be nowhere without the Islamic Republic of Iran. We would be nowhere. We didn't have missiles. It was only because of them, because of Qasem Soleimani, and because of Hezbollah, and because of Bashar al-Assad, that we had the missiles that we could attack Tel Aviv with. And people have got to understand that the material reality is you cannot take on the Israelis unless you have the military capability to do that. And the military capability doesn't come from Sunni groups like Al-QAEDA and ISIS, because, of course, they are not opposed in the end to the Zionists. They say that they are, but they are of course, not. And as Scott was saying just a few minutes ago, we know perfectly well that Israel Defense Forces field hospital in the Golan Heights, the illegally occupied Golan Heights, the same field hospital actually which Priti Patel, the British government minister, visited. That is the place where they were patching up members of Nusra, which became HTS, and sending them back to fight against Bashar al-Assad. So, it's perfectly clear that those forces, self-styled Sunni forces, which now rule Damascus, are not enemies of Israel, will not take on Israel, will not liberate Al-Quds, and will not allow the people in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus to travel to Al-Quds to pray, as being suggested by some of them. So I think there's a real difficulty in for a lot of the pro-Palestine movement in understanding the material realities of resistance in West Asia, and as a result, they have taken the wrong position, and I think it's a terrible shame.
Yeah, and I can just to add to what you were saying, David, from a point of civil liberties, Syria was the only Arab country that treated Palestinians as equals. My cousins are Palestinian in Syria, and they can attest to that. And you've got equal rights, equal responsibilities, like any other citizen. And that was under Bashar al-Assad and his father. It was only under their rule, and I don't know how that's going to look in the future. But do you think that the fall of Syria is a mortal blow to Palestine, considering that as you just mentioned, a lot of arms deliveries came through Syria, and there's the route, the highway these groups were dependent on. I'm trying to formulate the question without getting in trouble.
Well, look, I think that the fall of Syria is a defeat for the Palestinian resistance. I think there's no doubt about that. I think it's a defeat in a number of different ways, and there are a number of different negative things that have happened in parallel with or at the same time. One of them, of course, as Scott was talking about, is the role of Russia. Now, Russia has taken a decision to remove itself, and for whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's a bad thing, a mistake in terms of Russian foreign policy. That's what's happened, and that is a problem for the Axis resistance and for the Palestinian resistance. The Russians, of course, still have two bases. I believe it's their only two foreign bases in the region: the air base in Hamaim and the naval base in Tartus, which still exist, haven't been shut down. There was talk about them being shut down, and if they are going to walk away from that, of course, I slightly disagree with Scott actually on that, because look, those bases are of serious importance to the Russians in terms of their role in Africa, their staging posts for their role in Africa, and of course that is actually another important element of the question. So there's the Russian question. In terms of Iran, we of course have seen the change of president in Iran. Again, we don't exactly know what happened to the previous president, and of course his demise and the demise of the foreign minister looks all the more suspicious after the pager attacks in Lebanon and indeed in Syria at the time. So we have a new president in Iran who is very much pro-Western, who is in favor of negotiating with the Americans, and who, of course, believed the Americans when they said that they would get a ceasefire in Gaza many months ago, which, of course, was a lie. So we have a difficulty there in that the Iranians, the president at least, is not a believer in the resistance axis philosophy, which the IRGC and the Quds Force still are, and which, of course, the Supreme Leader Khamenei still is. But so you've got also a potential issue with Iran. So I think that those are really quite significant defeats for the axis of resistance. And of course, there's the pressure that Hezbollah felt with the conflict there, and we still have to wait to see to the extent to which Hezbollah is intact. It's saying it is intact and ready, and of course we've seen the glorious scenes of the ordinary people of South Lebanon liberating their villages and towns from the Israelis in the last few days. So that there are some very negative questions, but there are also, of course, some positive ones. And of course, the liberation of South Lebanon is one of them. The patent victory of the Palestinian resistance is another. in Gaza, and we sort of seen, of course, we've seen the images of the hostages and both sides being exchanged, etc. And we've seen, I mean, the Zionists really cannot bear seeing the massed ranks of the Qassam brigades and the Al-Quds brigades, and indeed I saw today the freed PFLP leader parading at will in Gaza. So we know that the Palestinian resistance is not defeated, and we know that in fact that they have inflicted a significant defeat on Israel, but it's not a significant defeat. It's not a defeat which is enough. We were not at the stage of saying, as we were some 6 months ago, it looks like the Zionist entity might collapse soon. That is no longer the case. So we've gone through a phase, I think, of much more optimism than we now have. But nevertheless, the axis of resistance is not destroyed. Yemen stands proud, and of course there is still the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and all of that is still in play. So I think that we should be, we should be objective about this, because there are real difficulties, but this is not the end of the struggle for Palestinian liberation, as I think everybody knows.
Yes, and I'll just add, if I may, that the Israelis set out several goals in this campaign. Getting hostages back by force, destroying all of the infrastructure, and they failed in that. But as you point out, they did make progress and headway in Syria, where I don't think any of us expected them to succeed in that theater. And of course the ramifications are truly large. I want to I want to just remind the viewers that we've had a flurry of Western leaders, for example, our foreign minister Lamy, going to Syria and meeting with Jolani. Baerbock from Germany as well did the same, and the French foreign minister, and so on. And I have to chuckle because I'm under investigation for terrorism, but it's okay for the foreign minister to go meet with the leader of a prescribed group. The double standard is really funny. The jokes write themselves. But these overtures that Jolani is trying to forge with the West, do you think that they're going to be successful? Do you think that they're going to lead to any success? And of course, I asked that by separating his group from Syria, because I don't think they share the same interests. But I want to know what you think.
Well, I don't think this is a question of overtures is not the right way of looking at this. I mean, Jolani is a CIA asset, and that's what the plan has been. So, of course, they are cozying up. Of course, the British government is looking at the prescribed terrorist list, and of course, that's going to be difficult for them because on the British government's list of prescribed organisations, there isn't even a separate entry for Nusra or for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS, because they are just regarded, according to the Home Office's own wording, as being part of Al-QAEDA, inseparable from Al-QAEDA. So it's going to be really difficult for them to de-prescribe HTS, because they're going to have to say, well, actually, it's not the same as Al-QAEDA anymore. It might have been like that, but it's not anymore. So that's going to be difficult for them. But look, we've seen what we've seen in the 7 weeks since this has happened, is that we have seen a huge outpouring of massachres, of attacks on, you mentioned Christians, yes, on Christians, but also on Alawites, on Shia, and indeed on Sunnis who are accused of having previously been in the Syrian Arab Army or have been in the previous government. So there's been a huge deluge across the country of attacks on minorities, murders, massacres, and of course these have been entirely ignored by the mainstream media, indeed also by much of the alternative media. But it's perfectly clear that this is happening. If you look at social media, if you look at Telegram, or even on X, you can see all of this. I mean, really gruesome footage of murders and torture, etc. So that's of course what they are doing. I mean, this is the ISIS in suits regime which runs Damascus now, and they are now, of course, the allies of the Americans and the French and the Germans and of course the UK, and that will continue. So it's not a question of overtures. Jolani is their man,
Right.
and they will pursue him as much as they can. But let's of course remember that what we're seeing here. I mean, you mentioned the question, and Scott said about the possibility of a Syria of the future. Well, no, like Syria is over, and what they want is what the Israelis want is a balkanized Syria, so that they can never threaten them again. And of course, that's why they destroyed all of its weaponry immediately after the fall. And of course, let's remember, we also heard just after this that before the fall, that they had destroyed a massive Quds Force base, which was being used for to store and to make weapons for Hezbollah. So we know that what the game is here, and we know that they will be pursuing the interests of Israel, and yes, of course, Israel has made various sounds about it this being that Jalani being problematic, maybe in some ways, but they're not at all unhappy with the fact that they have now destroyed the possibility of Syria resisting Israel, and of Syria helping and assisting the axis of resistance.
Yes, and you know, in terms of he is absolutely their man, and I'll just remind the viewers also, he spent some time, if I'm not mistaken, in Camp Bucha, and that one also had al-Baghdadi in there, and you know, I can't help but imagine you know, a scenario where these two were groomed and recruited and developed into assets. I mean, this is not, it's not beyond the pale. What do you think of that?
Well, that's of course what happened.
And you know, it's funny also because they go and kill them afterwards. It's like the mafia tying up loose ends. Do you think that they're going to maybe tie up Jolani at some point? Well,
if he outlives his usefulness, well, of course, that's what they'll do. I mean, that you know, it is the mafia. I mean, that they will use him as long as he is useful for them, and then they will cut him loose when the moment comes.
And what do you think of the fact that sanctions haven't really been lifted? They've been kind of, you know, beating around the bush. Like, we'll lift a few sanctions for a while. Doesn't that show that the sanctions and the Syrians in the opposition who supported these sanctions are actually, they have nothing to do with Bashar al-Assad, who is gone. They have everything to do with, you know, putting a boot on the neck of the Syrian people.
Well, of course, and that of course is also what as you mentioned, the American occupation of northeast Syria is about. The wheat, yes, and the oil, and of course, as you mentioned, the pipeline. I mean, that's the key question, isn't it? The pipeline was for the Turks, and let's remember that also that in the process of the fall of Syria, that the Turks entered Syria, the country, and dismantled factories and took them brick by brick back to Turkey.
Right.
So we've seen all sorts of stuff going on like that with the Turkish government, who of course not only are supporting HTS but supporting the Syrian National Army in the northwest, and of course that's part of their attempt to expand their influence. And let's remember, of course, that Turkey is a NATO power, and this has been no doubt done directly in concert with the CIA and, of course, with Israel, because, of course, Turkey, although Erdogan makes these big noises about being anti-Israel, is in fact a massive supporter of Israel. But we saw that with the eventually the pressure from the Turkish from the streets of Istanbul, etc., weighing through, and Turkey saying that they were going to boycott Israel. And what did they do? They managed to get their exports to Israel down to zero by the mechanism of relabeling the destination as Palestine, and at the same time providing the Israelis with all sorts of fresh fruit and vegetables, etc., without which they would not survive. So, I mean, Turkey is a supporter of Israel. Let's be clear about that.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it, and it's great speaking. And I'd like to bring in former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford. Thank you very much for being with us, Peter. How are you?
It's a pleasure, Richard. I've been fascinated listening to the others. I don't think there's much more to be said.
No, I mean, I agree in part, but of course your insight is unique owing to your professional service. And you know, I'd like to ask you, Peter, perhaps we can begin with the fears that many have expressed regarding the breakup of Syria. You know, we talked about this just a few moments ago with the Balkanization of Syria. Do you think that's a real possibility? And you know, given your time in Syria as British ambassador, what, you know, the insight that you gained, do you think that that's going to happen, perhaps?
I think people got a bit overexcited about this possibility of the Balkanization of Syria. States have a lot of staying power. If you look in history generally, it takes quite a lot to break up a state. Indeed, Syria has been subject to lots of outside pressures, but look at the situation today, and it's hard to see how the state would disintegrate. I mean, historically, Syria has been a powerful state, but outsiders have stolen pieces of land from it. The French parceled off Lebanon, which used to be part of the Bilad al-Sham, as they call it. And Turkey was given also by the French Alexandretta, the province of what is now called Hatay in Turkey. But Syria has always been a strong Arab state, and the operational word here is Arab, which hasn't been mentioned in this discussion so far, but it's absolutely central to the question of identity. And Syria saw itself historically as the beating heart of the Arab world. Its name, the clue is in the name, the Syrian Arab Republic. It may now be poised to become the Syrian Islamic Republic. That will be interesting to see. But Arab in Syria, the word Arab, the identity Arab, means something, as you know, Richard, in Syria, if it doesn't mean much in the rest of the Arab world. And this is a long story, but there are no Arabs anymore. I simplify. Syria was the last Arab standing, the last Arab state, because the Arab world has divided. You now have the Gulf Arabs who have their own organization, the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, much more powerful than the Arab League. Who cares today what the Arab League or its Secretary General, who knows who is the Secretary General of the Arab League today? The Arabs have been, to borrow your word, Richard, neutered. And Syria is on the way to becoming neutered. The whole Arab world has been emasculated, no longer dares to lift a finger to defend Gaza. The Arabs are nowhere, a pale shadow of themselves a mere 30, 40 years ago. So what's happened to Syria is, in a way, the end of a process of emasculation of the Arabs. There may still be pushback. I wouldn't guarantee the longevity of this new Islamist regime, but for the moment, they've got their feet under the table. I don't think they're going to lose any more territory. Indeed, it's more likely that they will recover the Kurdish regions. And unlike Scott, I don't have much sympathy or time for the Kurds, because it was the Kurdish treachery which led to all this. The Kurds, by effectively siding with the jihadis during the long years of conflict, by siding with their American protectors, by siding with Israel, by preventing Syria having access to its own resources of oil and grain, that is what brought down the Assad government. That and sanctions. And this is the other key word that Assad fell. If you needed a one-word explanation, it's sanctions. Even today, this very day, I saw a report from the United Nations. In Homs, they're getting 1 hour of electricity in every 8 hours.
Wow. Wow.
That is why Assad fell, and why Jolani might fall if he doesn't get sanctions lifted. Almost everything that's happening today revolves around this question of lifting of sanctions. It's obviously Jolani's top priority. Everything is geared to that, including today's dissolution of HTS and all the other jihadi militias, and the proclamation of a new interim administration or government, and the new interim president, Jolani himself. But HTS officially is no more. And so this solves at a stroke the question of whether Western governments will have dealings with HTS. It poses perhaps an interesting question for the philosophers, whether you can have contact with a body which denies its own existence and which has renamed itself. But I believe the Western powers will seize this opportunity and go along with this fiction that HTS is a dead parrot. So that is where we are in Syria, a dreadful state, as this UN report today underlined, dreadful economic suffering, lawlessness, a huge amount of lawlessness, HTS and the so-called police, the Islamist police are very thinly spread, and they also seem to be acting effectively in cahoots with criminal elements who are killing and plundering and stealing and conducting pogroms, roadside executions of surrendering soldiers, and conducting the ongoing massacres of Alawites and other minorities.
Yes, you mentioned the electricity, Peter. I'd just like to remind people that, in Syria, you used to have electricity cuts quite regularly, especially depending on the area that you're in. But I can say, in 2010, 2011, there were no more electricity cuts. No, I was actually shocked, pleasantly surprised that there were no more electricity cuts. That is a material, physical improvement of living conditions that no one can deny. I saw it with my own eyes. They just weren't. I'm not saying in the whole country, but I can tell you in Damascus there were no more. And of course, there was infrastructure constantly being renewed. So you can't deny that the country wasn't that the country was improving. You can't deny that, and it's just shocking to see how things have degraded. And we're supposed to believe that this is an improvement. I don't see the improvement in any sphere whatsoever, neither religious nor social nor material. I don't see it. It's non-existent to me. As a matter of fact, it's the complete opposite. It's degeneracy. And when it comes to what happened in, if I can perhaps draw on Afghanistan with the Taliban taking power there, do you feel that Syria as a secular country is dead? You mentioned these pogroms. You mentioned the roadside killings. These death squads walking around, picking on, seeking out Alawites specifically. And I think Ma'loula was also attacked again, by the way. You know, they had the nuns kidnapped in 2013 under Jolani, and then they had a short assault on it again in the last weeks. Do you think there will be any pushback against this, against HTS ideology?
Yes, I hope that's not wishful thinking on my part, but already there are journalists speaking up and complaining about the lack of transparency of what's going on in terms of governance, in terms of the proclamation today. And in a way, it's a good thing that the new regime are courting the West, and therefore, to some extent, they have to watch their behavior. They can get away with massacring Alawites. The West is not very interested in them, but they can't get away so easily with massacring journalists and prominent feminists, although some of this is going on very tragically. But they can't escape the microscope that they've invited onto the misdeeds, the abuses of the Assad era. Some of those telescopes are now trained on them. And I would expect the so-called democratic elements that claimed paternity of the Syrian revolution in the early days to become prominent again. As I say, this may be wishful thinking. Those elements are weak, always were very weak, but there are strong secular forces in Syria. This new regime, at most, has a certain degree of support or acquiescence on the part of the 60% of the population, which is Sunni. And that, by the way, is the other important word that hasn't been mentioned till now, but which is absolutely crucial in many ways. The Syrian long conflict was the war of Sunni supremacy. The Sunni majority in the country could not abide having a president and a ruling caste, if you like, who was not Sunni. And naturally, all these jihadis are Sunnis to a man and a woman. So there will be pushback, and this is one of the things that the West, having burst this new Islamist regime, can at least try to apply some brakes to Islamization, and using the lever of sanctions and oil perhaps ensure that at least the minimum standards of toleration are accepted and respected.
Well, I agree it's wishful thinking. I'm not going to hold out much hope for the West to look out for minorities in Syria. But I was out a few weeks ago, and a fan walked up to me and introduced themselves, and they were Syrian, and we started talking about what had happened, and we were both in agreement how in Syria it used to be rude, considered rude to even ask someone what sect, what religion, what background they are, because that went against the whole concept of a national identity, a secular identity. And of course, as you said, Peter, most of the population are Sunni. So, this isn't something that was, confined to just minorities doing that. It was everybody who appreciated and followed these customs of these social norms of not tolerance but coexistence. And he incidentally told me that he himself is Sunni, right? So we were just kind of lamenting the fact that this is no longer the case in Syria, that you can be asked by these militias, by these death squads, what sect you are, and you have checkpoints set up and harassing people. I mean, it's just it really is bewildering to me. It's not how I was. It's not the Syria that I know, and certainly not how how I was raised. You know, not once I faced any discrimination for being Christian. Not, you know, it's just not a thing, and I'm afraid that a lot of people have grown up because this civil war's gone on for 14 years now. You know, you have a generation, a whole generation of people that are growing up with sectarianism instead of appreciating that Syria had a very stable secular social identity. I want to ask you, Peter, what do you think that the UK should be doing in regards to Syria? What position should we be having? Do you think it's right that Lamy, the foreign secretary, goes and you know, shakes hands with an Al-QAEDA leader?
Well, Lamy is a shameful British foreign secretary. I mean, in a crowded field of underperforming and rather pathetic foreign secretaries, David Lamy stands out. He never puts a foot right, and never misses an opportunity to say something silly. And he's talked nonsense about Syria. He could redeem himself by exerting this pressure that I mentioned through sanctions, to be very explicit that, as far as we're concerned, there can be no lifting of sanctions until the massacres in the coastal regions have stopped, at least until the abductions of prominent feminists have stopped. And you can add to that wish list. And this will get the attention of Giuliani, because rightly or wrongly, the rest of the world sees Britain as a kind of moral arbiter. That is the soft power which inexplicably, I know, hard to understand, but it's a fact that the rest of the world does see Britain as having some moral authority. So for us, very explicitly to condition lifting of sanctions on the same list that we presented Assad effectively, respect for human rights, no more, no less. But I fumble this ball.
Yes, I think it's only fair to put it mildly, but it's just sad, really, watching all of this happen in real time. And of course, we have to remember that it relates to the Palestinian theater, if they can even be separated at all. And what do you think in regards of what happened recently in Lebanon? You know, Lebanon and Syria obviously used to be the same country as well, and share very close ties. What do you think of the recent change in leadership there? Because we've had all of these things happening at once, with you know, very, very long-term consequences.
I'm not too pessimistic about Lebanon. There are plenty of reasons to be gloomy, but knowing Lebanon, it's where I had my first proper job and where I learned Arabic, and having gone back there many, many times, it's a very resilient, effervescent society. And I think there is an outside chance that Lebanon could now, in the aftermath of these upheavals, get a life. That, and this is rather sad, but it will turn its back on Palestine. And let's remember that for 16 years, Hezbollah kept that border with Israel quiet, including by using violence against Palestinian groups based in the Ain al-Helwe camp in the south, kept that border quiet. Because Hezbollah doesn't exist just to support the Palestinians. That was only ever a means to an end. Hezbollah has its own constituency, largely Shia, in Lebanon. And it has a very strong interest in the stability of Lebanon. It was Hezbollah that prevented Lebanon being sucked into the maelstrom of the Syrian conflict next door, when many experts were predicting that Lebanon would be sucked in. So Hezbollah has other important tasks to survive in the first place, and to continue with its major task of defending the Shia community within Lebanon, and in so doing, in preserving the stability of Lebanon. So I'm, in a phrase, I hope Lebanon can get a life now. It's hard to imagine that Hezbollah or any other force in Lebanon would go back to shelling Israel, even under the extreme provocation of the Gaza genocide. But we can see that Hezbollah and Lebanon paid a very, very heavy price for what they did, going to, as they saw it, the rescue of the Palestinians, and not getting much thanks. I'm sorry, but this has to be mentioned.
Yeah.
As you well know, that many on the Palestinian side, on the Sunni side, did not appreciate Hezbollah, did not appreciate Iran. Well, perhaps it's time for the Lebanese to get a life. I hope they can.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate it very much, and it's always good to speak to you. We'll just wrap up with something short. I'll just give my closing thoughts. I'll put it this way. Syria is going through a very tough period of change, and that, of course, has to be seen within the context of the Gaza genocide. We can't separate Syria from Palestine socially, culturally, historically, never mind politically, with everything that's been going on. It was the land bridge that connected Iran, Iraq to Lebanon and Palestine, and now that land bridge, that cultural bridge, also has been broken. It's been severed, and we have to, we have to call a spade a spade. This is a victory for the West, and it is a victory for Israel. But it doesn't mean that it's a permanent loss, and it doesn't mean that Syria will not rise up from the ashes. I will remind the viewers that we are talking about the cradle of civilization. We're talking about the Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Syria's story is very, very, very long, and if you go back through almost any period in the last 10,000, 12,000 years, and you say Damascus, people will know what you're talking about. So Syria's story is a very long one, and it hasn't been written yet. Its end is not near, and that conclusion hasn't been written yet. There are many emperors, many empires, many powers that have come and gone and left their ruins for people to go and gaze at inside of Syria, from the Greeks to the Romans to France to the French Empire. Everyone has come and gone, and they were never able to hold on to it. And I believe that will be the same in the case of the Israelis and the United States. So Syria's story is not over. It's far from over. But our conclusion remains the same. We say no to NATO, and we say no to war. Turkey and the United States, two of the biggest players in this occupation of Syria, are NATO armies. They are the largest armies in NATO, the most powerful ones. And Syria has been a victim, just as Ukraine, just as Afghanistan, just as Iraq, of NATO's expansionism. And it's an entity that has outlived its purpose. It was created during the Cold War to fight the Soviets. We don't have Soviets anymore. There is no more nuclear threat. NATO should have been disbanded long ago. It has no purpose, and certainly it fulfills nothing constructive in terms of its role, but rather quite the opposite. If we look at the top three countries, where refugees come from, it's Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. what do these countries all have in common? They have in common the fact that they've been destroyed by NATO. So we repeat our conclusion again. We say no to NATO, no to war. My name is Richard Medhurst. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you during the next live stream. Thank you very much.